All of you saw information about the Sustainability Apparel Coalition last night and heard from Rick Ridgeway and Jason as well. So in order to continue that value chain discussion, we have one of our members from the outside, Manish Bapna, who is with the acting director of, or president of the World Resources Institute, come up here, and he has an eminent panel discussion on the value chain in the apparel retail industry. So Manish, welcome.
Okay. Please, and invite your okay, sure. Thank you, MRPJ, for both the kind invitation to be here today. WRI participates in a lot of corporate sustainability conferences. Over the years, we've been engaging with the private sector for about 15, 20 years on these issues. And I can say that I've rarely heard such high praise for an event as this one. And I think you guys do a terrific job of being able to really kind of identify and sharpen the value proposition you provide everyone. So congratulations. Delighted to welcome everyone to this plenary discussion on the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. Let me invite our speakers, and then I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to help set the context, but let's get the people you came to hear from up on the stage. We have Rick Ridgeway, who's the VP of Environmental Initiatives and Special Media Projects at Patagonia. Lori Vogel, the General Manager of Sustainable Product Research and Discovery from Nike, and Shawn, the Senior Vice President of Marketing from Target. So let me at least invite them onto the stage. Welcome. I'm going to turn to them in just a moment, but let me just say a couple of words about this panel. It's especially refreshing to be here today. I just spent literally the last 10 days in Rio. And on the flight back from Rio, there were two things that I wanted to do. One, I wanted to actually read about the coverage on Rio, kind of what was the postmortem, the analysis on what happened in Rio. But also, I needed to really kind of get myself ready for this panel, so I read a lot about the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And in terms of Rio, I think the media coverage was a bit harsh, but probably still accurate. That it was a bit of a disappointment in terms of what the official process produced. Clearly not something that was commensurate to the challenges that we face. But as someone who goes to many of these conferences, was struck by the presence of the private sector. Really active, very high profile, lots of buzz, quite a few new additional exciting initiatives. But that said, even if you add up all the things that business proposed at Rio, it still fails to come to the level of ambition we need to substantially tackle the issues we're facing around climate change, around water, around forests, around local communities, and how we make sure they have a stake in the development process. And so I kind of read all that analysis, and then I turned to learning a little bit more about this coalition. And it's just so remarkable. I mean, this coalition, in terms of the ambition, I was struck by what I read. The vision is to produce no unnecessary environmental harm, to have a positive impact on people and communities associated with its activities. A very, very kind of ambitious vision statement, yet a tool that's very practical, that would have fairly immediate business use. Something that's just incredibly innovative. I mean, not tackling just a single issue, but really trying to tackle a wide range of environmental and social issues, a tool that is quantitative, that is life cycle based, that works in multiple scales. And so it just kind of got me very excited to learn more about this. And it's not a surprise that you guys won the kind of coalition award last night, the C.K. Prahalad Award. And this to me is kind of what Rio needs to be about. That innovation of that kind of the private sector can bring, and at a scale that would make a difference. So let's get this started. What we're going to try to do is start with a few initial remarks from each of the panelists. Then I have a couple of specific questions on particular characteristics of the coalition. We'll then open it up to the audience for some Q&A, and then we'll close. And I've asked the panelists to kind of sum up in a sentence or two some particular insight that they got from today's session. So with that, I'm gonna start with Rick. Patagonia's been a founding member of this coalition, kind of one of the parents of the coalition. And so I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about how did this grand idea kind of come about? What were some of the first steps that you and Patagonia took to make this coalition a reality?
Sure, happy to do that. It started with two concurrent developments at Patagonia. The first was an engagement we had for several years with Walmart, who about 7 years ago had come to us asking help with developing an organic cotton program for their private label apparel. And you might think that with a brand like Patagonia, who had as their brand differentiator the fact that we made all of our stuff from organically grown cotton, willing to help the biggest company in the world to essentially undermine our brand differentiator was something you wouldn't want to do. It's like on the surface, suicide. But that's not. Patagonia is privately held. Again, our owner, Yvonne, says that means we get to do what we want, and we want to help other companies. We're in this together. We'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, we helped Walmart out, and they adopted organically grown cotton pretty quickly, became the biggest user of it in the world. And in one of the meetings following up that collaboration, they asked us if there's anything else that we could do together. And concurrent to this work with Walmart, we had been working with our trade organization, the Outdoor Industry Alliance, to develop a tool that would measure the environmental impact of stuff. And it was a tool developed to measure stuff because our trade organization has members that make everything from apparel like ourselves and footwear to bicycles to power bars. So in the meeting room with Walmart, they say, what can we do together? And the idea just popped into our heads to ask them to join us, to invite other companies into the room to see if we could take this tool and scale it. It would be great, it was great that it was going to be in the outdoor industry, but what if it really broadened out to the entire sector? That was the idea. That's where it started. So colleagues in the apparel division at Walmart and our team started to shape this idea. And we came up with some early principles that turned out to be prescient. I think they've actually been in part responsible for the later success of this group. And one of them was to invite into the room initially just companies that would be willing to develop the strongest tool that they could. That, every time you came to a fork in the road, you'd try to take the higher instead of the lower path. And then we still wanted enough companies to give it what we call gravitational pull. So those are competing tensions, which meant that you had to vet who you invited in initially very carefully, and then work with that core group to establish the culture. And one of the principles that we aligned on right away was this idea of not letting perfection get in the way of good enough. That you wanted to build something that you could get done quickly and get online quickly, knowing that you'd have to continually improve it. So we all aligned around that principle, and then we also wanted to build on existing work whenever possible. Well, the outdoor industry had already had this, some work that they had done, but we quickly learned that other members, including, and most especially my colleague Lori from Nike, and she'll tell you in a minute about the work that they'd done, that you want to, again, use the work that other people are doing, put it together, and create something out of those pieces stronger than any of the individual, any of the work that individual companies or even organizations have been doing alone. So with that, we sent out a letter to a dozen very carefully selected companies. We're marketers at Patagonia, so we put the logo for Walmart right next to Patagonia at the top of the letter, knowing that that would get some attention, and sent it out to the CEOs of these other companies. And they all came back and said, when you get a letter with the two logos side by side, it's so bizarre that you got to read it. And they did. And they all accepted the invitation. We got together initially in New York in February of 2010, and decided to have a formal meeting in April of 10 as a group. And now, just a couple years later or less, we've made enormous progress. And I think before the morning ends, it'd be interesting if some of us could comment on, why now? Why is now the time when you can bring a group like this together in a sector and achieve as much as we have in such a short amount of time?
Thank you. I like the perfection not getting away and the good enough. I mean, I think that's just, for us as an organization, also just an important principle to think about. Let me turn to Lori. Nike's put in quite a bit of effort and expense in developing tools and metrics to evaluate sustainability in the apparel industry. And then you joined this coalition, and you've even made some pretty important proprietary data around material sciences available to the coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about the history around this and what led you to make this decision to donate this material?
Sure. I think it's really important kind of to understand a little bit more about Nike, what we view sustainability to be. We have a charter from our CEO, Mark Parker, which is that he wants sustainability to be an ethos of the company. And so one of the things that we have been trying to drive is looking at our largest environmental impacts. And so for us at Nike, it's really around the products that we create. So one of the first things that we did was we really wanted to focus around our design community, because there are innovators in the company. So if we could teach them how to make better choices, we could see the impact all the way down the value chain. And so that's one of the first things we did, is we created our apparel index, and we created our footwear index. So at the moment a designer starts to sketch a shoe or a shirt, it gives them instant feedback on how they're doing around choosing more environmentally preferred materials, how they're doing around reducing waste, around toxics. And so for us, that was really important, because we realized there were no tools. We would have bought commercially available tools, but they weren't available for us to use. The same thing was true when we started to measure our material suppliers. There was not a commercially available tool out there. So we needed to create a system by which we would start to measure our material suppliers. So our model has really all been about leverage. We want to leverage the designer's expertise. We want to leverage our material suppliers, so that when we score our material suppliers, that they know how they compare to the competition, and it really starts to see that drive happen. And so one of the things, when we started to measure our designers and we set goals that by 2011 we wanted all of our footwear to meet our baseline standards, we wanted all of apparel by 2015, when we just hit our goal for footwear for 2011, we started to see the impact of this work. So for example, we saw a 19% reduction in waste across the board. So for Nike, that's the equivalent of not producing 15 million pairs of shoes. So one of the things, as we started to drive these tools and systems, we realized the impact to Nike's ecosystem. And so for us, to imagine the impact these systems and tools would have on the entire industry was really, really important. Because one of the things that you find within our supply chain is that even though we're one of the larger players, in some cases, we can still be less than 10% within a factory, within a supplier. And so we really need the entire industry to come with us in order to achieve the impact that we really want to see in this space. And I think the other thing, when you ask about why would we open up systems and tools, is the tools that we opened up, I think we calculated it was around $7 million worth of work that Nike had done on these systems. And so for us, the truth is we're not in the business of creating tools. We only did it out of necessity. So it is a much better model for the industry to build upon these systems and tools, go from version 1 to version 2, and that allows Nike really to kind of get after other work. So for us, it was a win-win situation when Rick kind of approached us around the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the idea that collectively we could actually achieve that much more.
Fantastic. Let me turn to Shawn. Target's also a founding member of the coalition. You're aggressively rolling out this index, as I understand it, to some of your facilities, thinking about even going beyond apparel. Tell us a little bit more about why Target kind of came into the coalition and your thinking.
Well, I think I actually go back to the scale of Target, and Andy, I was struck by the comments made earlier around starting local and then sort of building out from there and sort of applying it to more of a global perspective. And I mean, Target from inception 50 years ago was always focused, really early giving in our community giving was around supporting natural resources and waterways. As we've grown now, 50 years older, 1,800 stores and a global sourcing business, it's become apparent that the impact that we have as a brand in what we do is much greater. And so I think it's that same acknowledgement of moving from local to global and acknowledging the fact that as a mass retailer, doing mass sourcing, and not only apparel, but across many different merchandise categories, it really was a beginning point for us. And so when Rick and Blue Sky approached us about joining, it was pretty much a no-brainer for Target to say this is something that was underway. It was already a commitment of the company. And this would, to Lori's point, be something that would allow us to scale much faster. So if you think just the pure number of sourcing locations that we have for the breadth of business, it really does allow us that tool that all of us can sort of join around and be able to embrace, to Lori's point, leverage, and then I think also help suppliers be able to get up to speed faster with a common tool versus sort of applying each of our individual needs to their business to try to give us sort of reporting as we need it.
One of the things that struck me when I read a little bit about this coalition is this concept of pre-competitive collaboration, right? And you touched upon it, a couple of you touched upon it, that kind of tackling the toughest bottlenecks together, right? And could you tell us a little bit more about this? What exactly is it? Where would you see pre-competitive collaboration work? What would motivate you to do that? And where could it actually be a little bit tough to go into? Or on what issues would that be a little bit perhaps not the place to go? One of you want to try to start a little bit with that?
I can just jump in.
Yeah.
And there's so many areas that we can share resources. So for example, when we started to evaluate some of the tools we were looking at, life cycle analysis is a huge expense for us. In fact, I think $3 million of that tool was just looking at the life cycle analysis of cotton, whether it's grown in India or whether it's grown in Texas or where, you know. So when you start to look at the life cycle analysis, the truth is, does Target and Walmart and Patagonia have to spend the exact same money to look at the life cycle analysis around all the different materials? So for us, I think there's a great economy to share a lot of this work. I think there's some areas too that we would like to develop better standards around chemistry. So I think that there's a lot of areas that we can see that there's a lot of synergy, that there's no reason for us to be developing, and we could definitely share resources in this space.
You know, I might jump in, if I may, and add another foundational principle to the coalition that touches on this topic of pre-competitive collaboration, and that is our own coalition's recognition at the very beginning, at the headwaters of our organization, that even as a coalition of businesses, we couldn't do it on our own. And that we needed, in addition to the wisdom of the collective wisdom of the businesses in the coalition, the wisdom from the NGO community, such as yourselves at WRI and at EDF and at NRDC, who were also invited and joined the coalition and have been instrumental in adding ideas and value to our work. We couldn't have done it without you guys and your cohorts. Additionally, we invited academics to join us, and specifically Duke University and Utrecht University in Europe, who are themselves life cycle assessment leaders, science leaders, have been in the coalition with us, adding immense value to what we're doing. And then we have opened our doors to government. Since we started in nearly all of our meetings, the EPA has had representatives there with us. We're in discussions with the EU now. We've invited a Chinese NGO with good government connections to come and join our group as well. That's an essential foundational strategy that is in part responsible for our success.
I would only add that I think if you get to the definition of pre-competitive, right, for all of the brands and all the NGOs and all the partners involved in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, it comes down to the heart and mindset of consumers expects that this is a baseline. This is not an add-on. And so I think you have to get to that point in a coalition like this where you realize that there isn't extra credit given for this. It's almost the expectation of a consumer that brands, iconic brands, small brands, and interested suppliers are going to be responsible in sourcing. And I think once you get to that point, it's easy to come together to solve the problem because it's something that we all face.
So that takes me maybe to another question, a nice segue. So WRI, as you mentioned, is kind of engaged in this coalition. One of the things that we thought was quite interesting was the potential for this to become kind of a B2C, a consumer-facing label. Yet earlier in the morning when we were just talking a little bit about that, some of you had some kind of thoughts that maybe that's actually not the most influential aspect of what this coalition, what this label might create. And I was wondering if you could pick up on that and talk a little bit about the consumer-facing label and the B2B kind of piece and where we could get real traction here.
Well, I would just frame it by saying, going into this, I intuitively thought the B2C component was ultimately going to be the biggest driver. And when I shared that with Lori early on, when we first formed this, she pushed back and said, I don't think so. And over the months that we've been engaged on this, I've turned around to actually her thinking. Because I've been able to see the influence that measurement has in a B2B environment, and it is just enormous. And I've actually personally come to the conclusion now that the B2B use of a measurement tool is going to be a much more effective driver of change than its conversion to a B2C facing index rating. And I don't know if that sets you up for a little deeper dive into that comment, Lori, but you're the one who's been the original thinker on this for me.
So how did you change Rick's mind?
Well, I think the one thing is what we saw when we were pushing this out to our suppliers is that really it takes them time to learn it. It takes them time to figure out how to measure it. It takes them time to get on board. If right away you're going to make it consumer facing, it's almost like you're flogging your supply chain. And so that's really not what we wanted to do. We wanted to give them time to raise the bar. And then once we got them to a certain level, then it became the moment where we could make that consumer facing, because what you don't want is you don't want them to cheat the data. You want them to feel like they can be transparent and they can share the data with us, and we'll help them get to a new level. But if right away it becomes consumer facing, the impetus to really give us bad data is too great, and we want them to feel like we're partners with them. And then when you get to, but it doesn't mean that I don't think eventually it should be consumer facing. I think you just need to give your supply chain time to get to that place.
So the importance of trust, just building that trust up early on.
You need trust across the board, because if we're the man trying to flog and to show that this is not the these suppliers do it better than these suppliers, it just doesn't work that well.
I was asking Jason Kibbe, who's here, who's the executive director of the coalition, just on this point about trust, what are some of the tough choices for the coalition moving forward? And one of the questions is about third-party verification. Will the coalition move towards endorsing, engaging third-party verification in a systematic way? And just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, again, I think our colleagues at Nike have been kind of leading the way and thinking about how you might actually develop a way to mine the data out of the supply chain that is verified and trustworthy. And the coalition's really working on that. That is probably the single biggest challenge we're facing, because as we've just said, if you go consumer facing with a label and there is somebody in the supply chain who games it, and then because you're also built on a foundational principle of transparency, then that becomes exposed, the trust is going to be gone. And it'll take years to build it back, and you may never get it back. So you don't want to go consumer facing until you have a very secure system of data inputs in. And we're working on how to do that right now. And the work's progressing, but it's an enormously challenging task because it has to be scalable at the same time. And it's not scalable if you have a full army of third-party verifiers out there at an enormous expense checking on every data set coming in. But Jason is in the front room here too, and I don't know if you want to speak to that later on yourself, Jason, or Lori. We are working on it.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard question. I personally hate the idea of auditing. I think what you do is you just give everybody, you basically are asking companies, are you cheating? Or are you giving us the appropriate data? I'm actually a much larger fan of transparency. And if you're transparent and that data is transparent, I guarantee you that the competitor supplier knows if that information is real. And so these things kind of start to bubble up. I hate to, I just think the whole principle around auditing, not that in some cases you do need it, but I would much rather drive to transparency and drive to people really, if the data is incorrect, that actually comes to fruition, that you can actually see that, because you just create this whole mechanism around auditing. I think it also just incentivizes kind of this sneaking around the other way. So I'd much rather it be more of, this is the integrity of that company. The CEO signs off on the fact that this data is correct.
I would say just as much as we needed the economies of scale and the definition around the coalition forming, we needed in the continuing operation. And I think to that point, I mean, I think the peer review is really going to be the place where we'll have to have the reliance, whether it is for our own, you know, business reliance on the data, or whether it is something that eventually becomes consumer facing.
Another very important foundational value to underscore is full transparency. It's only going to work with a deep and thorough commitment across the board to that, including the data. And it may be even especially including that, because then it can become self-policing.
So one more question before I turn it over to the audience. You know, you won last night the CK Prahalad Award. He was on our board, and one of the things that he constantly talked about was next practice. And so I was wondering if you could just imagine that the coalition was wildly successful, kind of in 5 or 10 years, paint us a vision of what that would look like. How would the apparel industry look different?
Well, there's an interesting potential parallel here that I think it's, you can argue that the apparel industry started the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. And I think the work that we're doing now has the opportunity of having our sector create a roadmap that could lead us to the sustainability revolution. I really do feel like we're creating a roadmap for how to get to that end point where products that are made more sustainably can potentially even cost less than products that are more harmful to the environment. I think we're starting to find a path forward to that ultimate condition. And it would be so immensely satisfying if 10 years from now we could look back and say, you know, we had some ideas that helped everyone on that path. And, well, there's others, all of you here are on that path in different ways. So it's our hope that our learnings can perhaps be shared with many of you here. That would be a wonderful vision 10 years from now.
I also would hope that, you know, at Nike we see sustainability as a source of growth and innovation. And so what I would hope is that we would start to see that throughout the industry, so that you could, I always believe that if you tell people where you want to go, they get there faster. And so the idea that you set up parameters to tell suppliers, manufacturers where you want to go, that also then the folks will innovate into a new place. And so we talk about the vision on where we want to be down the road, and it's really around closed loop products. So the idea that, you know, can you bring an entire sector to have a shared vision so that you're able to recycle those materials, so that we're innovating and that we are driving those innovations? Because one of the things that you'll find is there's always the folks within the group that just want to pass the baseline, and there are those who really want to raise the bar. And to me, that's where the innovation happens. So you'll see so much more innovation happening within the apparel space.
And I guess I would add that, you know, if a macro trend right now is sustainability or awareness or responsible sourcing, I don't think this is a niche play anymore. I think that's where I would just say growth and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. And I think that as a mass retailer, we acknowledge that. I reflect back to Rick's comment a moment ago around the applicability of the coalition's learnings into other industries is something that we're very interested in, I think, from a scalability perspective. And I think that's something that will be a common embrace. I think everyone here probably would agree that it's something that begins to a conversation, and you know, it only starts with changing one thing.
Great. Let's open this up. I mean, I thought the comment about what could be learned from the apparel industry that could have relevance for other industries is kind of a really important theme to also keep in mind. But let's open this up and take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Can you imagine, in the fullness of time, you taking responsibility across the value chain for the garments that you prepare and their end-of-life use? So you'll be aware of the Marks & Spencer's initiative on swapping and having people bring the garment back, and they accepting responsibility for that. So first is supply chain. Do you want to transform the entire industry, or is this quite an exclusive club? And secondly, will you take full responsibility across the value chain in the fullness of time?
Well, I can take at least one and even touch on the second one.
If you want, yeah.
Perfect. On your first question, Gavin, in its startup phase, the coalition was by invitation only. And again, as I said initially, strategically that was to get in the room people willing to always take the higher road at any decision point. But we formally organized the group as a structured trade organization that launched in January with Jason, our colleague, as the founding executive director. And at the same time, we opened our doors to any and all, with the hope that indeed as many of our cohorts in our sector would join. So we want everybody in if possible. But we believe that we've, in the startup phase, established our operational principles sufficiently that as we broaden membership, they will remain in place to guide the group's work. And that at the time of launch in January, that work was sufficiently developed that it's very hard to weaken it and water it down or dumb it down, pick your word. But so far, that strategy has worked. Then on to your second question. Lori, do you want to take that one?
So I think your question when you talk about end of life, I think it talks about what we're trying to do with the index overall. I think the one thing is I kind of look at the index like modules. You know, there's different parts and modules in there. And so there are things that are easier to put in first that are kind of knowns and that companies have already been working towards. I think that end of life will be a component of this eventually. I don't think when we talk about version 2 and 3, I think those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to start to collectively look at. We already start to see end of life taxes happening in Europe. We're even seeing it here in Maine, so in the US. So I think that end of life, we're going to have to collectively figure out an answer around that. And so I think that it's maybe a little early in the conversation, but I think that that conversation is going to start to happen. So what I would say is that we're kind of starting out within the supply chain in those areas that we have more knowns, and then we will expand it out, I would imagine, as the next versions come into fruition.
Yes, we will, and we've built a framework of this index measurement tool that includes a category of impact for end of life. And even now in the release version, which the 1.0 version's due next month, it'll be done, it has qualitative indicators in there that brands are required to answer that address whether or not they have end-of-life programs. But those will, as Lori said, will evolve. There's also a category of impact for customer use and care. Again, to answer your question about whether it's a full value chain perspective, and it is. From materials extraction all the way through end-of-life, there are categories of impact that are in the framework that, as Lori said, will have to be built out over the future, but including biodiversity and ecosystem impacts as well. We expect in the future that the tool will include those impacts as well.
But even as we start to measure different parts of this, so even in the design process, we already start to score materials better if they use fewer materials, if you're less than 2 materials, those types of things. So as you reduce, because we know that it's that much harder to recycle when you have more materials. So we already are kind of setting it up.
Yeah, the categories of impact are the what's being impacted, you know, but, or where the impacts are in the value chain. Those are the categories, but what is being impacted in all those categories is what's measured, and that's things like water use, and it's toxics and chemicals, it's greenhouse gas emissions, it's waste. And it will be labor and social, too. We haven't really got on that yet, but we're going there in our work.
Let's take, I saw a few more hands. Please.
Yeah, so Mark Agar from Microsoft. Actually, that was a perfect segue to my question. So I was thinking about lessons learned from the Foxconn debacle and Apple. Doesn't seem to have made a lot of difference to Apple's sales of their devices, despite all the negative press. So I'm just curious what the panel thinks, that bodes for the future of consumer interest in sustainability.
So I will just say we did this eco-materials forum at Harvard, and we were trying to drive the use of environmentally preferred materials. So we brought in, the government sector, we brought in business, we brought in industry experts. And one of the things that came out of that is that corporations are ahead of government and government's ahead of the consumer. And so I would say that I really believe as we start to build out this system that we're basically kind of creating a standard by which we start to judge the industry, and I think the government can help us in this space as we start to drive a lot of this. And I think that the consumer comes even after that, because I think that in this space, unfortunately, especially when we talk about environment and social as well, it's confusing, and so it's very difficult for them to wrap their head completely around it. So I would say that I actually have more hope that the government will drive more change, and then the consumer will drive that change after.
But we're going to influence government if we're to be successful. And that's one of the big takeaways, I think, for everybody in the room here. And I know most of you are thinking this already, but when you look at what happened at Rio, you can only come to the conclusion that business has to be the agent for the change that our societies need, because we can't rely on government to do it. And I think an effort like ours has the ability to influence government. We're already starting to do that. We're already starting to directly see, especially in the case of the EU, how we are in dialogue with them. They're listening to what we're doing, and they're showing and indicating a willingness to even embrace and accommodate some of our work into their policy and regulations. That's what our role needs to be. So, and I'm talking about our role as the business community on planet Earth.
Does the coalition have an explicit kind of mandate to try to engage and inform policy?
We don't at the moment, but we are. Well, we are actually. We're doing it right now because, as I said at the beginning, we've invited government in to join us in an open forum, in a space of transparency and trust, to have this dialogue. And they have accepted that invitation. As I said, EPA has been at the table from our very first meeting. We've engaged with the EU. We're engaging with the Chinese.
And just a quick side point, as an organization that focuses quite a bit on policy, I can just attest to just how incredibly powerful it is when we do have business speak out about having the right policy. When I think about climate legislation, the debate in the United States over the past few years, perhaps the most iconic moment, even though nothing passed the Senate, probably the most iconic moment was actually the set of CEOs from this U.S. Climate Action Partnership testifying before Congress and making the case as to why mandatory legislation was in their commercial interest. And so just a strong plea from our side about just how important it is to have business speak out about good policy.
Yeah, and what a great job MR and the others in this group are doing. As you did in Rio, MR, you're to be applauded for that, for bringing this group in front of government to tell them that business realizes that at the end of the day, we're all dependent on the natural resources of this planet for the health of our businesses. Without the health of those resources, there is no business. And they are listening to us, as you know. So again, we really thank you for your leadership at that conference.
I'm mindful of the time, so let me just see if there's any final, I'll take a final set of questions and I'll ask each of you to respond and provide maybe some final remarks. So I'll take 3 questions. I see one here, one there, and then one in the back. Okay, please.
Hi, thanks. Rose Perkins from Dow Chemical. Just interested to know your connection with the Sustainability Consortium, or is there even a connection or any plans to tie into that organization?
Yeah, we are in...
let me just take, just because of the time, let me just take 2 or 3 at a bunch, and then I'll have you all respond to it. So the first question was about possible links to the Sustainability Consortium.
I'm Roberta Bowman, most recently with Duke Energy, and deeply involved in the U.S. Climate Action Partnership as well. We talked about the foundational principles as being really important. I'm just also curious in other success factors to make a coalition be successful.
Okay. Other factors, and I'll take one more question in the back over there.
Hi, I'm Mark Newton at Timberland, and I just wanted to thank all of you guys for being such great partners in this process. It's fantastic to be able to partner with you on this. And my question is, as we broaden this, and we need to in order to increase the impact, bring in more people, we need to compromise as we move it forward. How do we maintain the high standards of the coalition and of the standard itself so that we don't water it down?
So the three questions, links to the Sustainability Consortium, kind of what other principles bind the coalition, and how do you maintain high standards? So maybe what I'll do is I'll ask each of you to just take a minute, kind of respond to one or a subset. But then also just given if you could also just, if you had to impart one short piece of advice to the group, some kind of insight that you've gained from your experience in the coalition, what would that one piece of advice be? So maybe I'll just go down the line this way, and I'll ask Rick to start and Shawn to close.
Now I'm to answer one of the questions?
Well, yes. Take the choice of questions you wish to answer.
Well,
and then
your question about the Sustainability Consortium, and we have been in dialogue from them, right from the beginning, with the academic founders of the coalition and with some of the members, especially with Walmart. And I think as the consortium is in a stage of transition right now, and it's my understanding that you're searching for, I believe you're a member there. Excuse me, that the TSC is in a transition with a new executive director about to come on board, and it's our hope that we can engage directly with TSC to see how, again, together we can reach these goals, some of which have been articulated in the room here this morning. So we are, very interested in full engagement with them and with every other group that's in this same space, especially with the Consumer Goods Forum, for example, that we all need to figure out how to work together so we don't duplicate each other's work, and that collectively we can all get to this common goal for the common challenges that we face.
Lori, do you want to pick up one of the other questions?
Yeah, so I actually see these two questions, the last two, kind of tying a little bit together. So to me, I would say one of the things that I really thought that helped this coalition work really well is that when you approached us, it was really about approaching the companies that were leading in this space. So first and foremost, you brought together companies that wanted to see this change happen, and at the same time, you weren't bringing together a coalition to get to the least common denominator around what you wanted to do. It was about the companies that really wanted to drive this type of change, and I think that's really important, and that relates to your question as well, which is, how do you make sure that you keep the standards high? Because it is true, we want everybody a part of the coalition and we want the entire industry, but there is something to be said, which is the whole reason you create a coalition is because you want to drive things to be more positive as far as really driving to a new place. And I think as long as you have the right board of directors and leadership and it's built on that foundation, I don't think you'll go backwards from that. And so I guess to your point, kind of what I've learned through this whole process is that a lot of times you can get stuck and not do anything. I will just tell you, there is no standard LCA out there. There is not even a common way that people look around materials. So we could have been stopped 100 times. And so I think the thing is that it's much better to get to a point, you might even be at 80%, but if you can all get to where you need to be, the next version will be that much better. You'll learn so much in the process. I'm a designer by trade. I'm all about prototyping. I think it's really important to get your hands dirty, to create something, and then move that something. But you don't want to be in theory forever. You'll lose the people who wanted to be a part of the coalition because now all of a sudden there's tangible results. People are excited, and they want to be a part of it.
As Lori linked those last two questions together, I think it was brilliant, simply because I think that we all have to compromise some of our own individual demands of what comes out of the coalition, but we can never compromise the larger messaging and the larger cause in which we all participate. So I think authentic and transparent contribution is really for everyone as they join. We just need to make sure that that is never compromised, to make sure that everything is sort of out on the table. I would say one thing that we have learned is that the story supporting the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and responsible sourcing is an economic win. And I think that that is not always the starting point, if you will, when we look at these types of issues, because again, back to the is it a niche play and is it supported from a business perspective? The reality is, as we move into the supply chain and we build out this story across multiple brands and across multiple suppliers, it ultimately will create more efficiency within the system. And so there is that time frame, and Andy mentioned it a moment ago as it relates to looking out 10 years, and I think that's a position that all of us need to be in, to be able to know that in the end there is a payoff, and it's a very favorable one.
Great. Rick, do you want to have a final insight? And then
Final. Yesterday, I came to realize in discussions in the breakout sessions that most of you in your sectors have coalitions that are trying to solve some of the things that we've done, that you've realized that you can't manage what you don't measure, and there are efforts very similar to ours going on, for example, in electronics with the EICC that I learned more about yesterday. And there are things in those efforts that we can learn from. And we believe that in our experience so far, we have lessons that all of you might learn from as well. And we invite all of you to consider that. We would love to learn from you, and we'd love to share our knowledge with you again. We're all in this together. We're all facing these global challenges together, and together, not just in our sector of apparel and footwear, but in all the sectors in this room, we've got to collectively find a solution.
I think that's a great note on which to close this session. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Let me turn it over to